Good afternoon, Professor Richard Falk. We are delighted to be having you today. This morning, the Israeli occupation raided, confiscated, and closed the offices of 6 West Bank-based human rights and law Palestinian NGOs. I recall us having a conversation maybe 9 months ago when the whole story started, and when the occupation started its campaign, at least in the media, in order to achieve a European and American consents and to stop the financial support to these NGOs. Could I kindly ask you first to comment on the very action which took place in the West Bank and mainly in Area A, please?
Well, this, as far as I know, this is a rather unprecedented action, even by a harsh occupying power. And it's directed at these civil society organizations, including leading and internationally respected NGOs that have for years delivered what were regarded as very reliable reports on Israel's policies and practices under occupation. So it's a severe way of trying to nullify the capacity of Palestinians to tell the world their story under very difficult situation that has been confirmed over and over again. And from the perspective of international humanitarian law, these NGOs were doing a responsible job in protecting Palestinian civilian society from the abuses to which they had been exposed to. And that is really central to the undertaking of international humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the general idea that an occupied people is entitled to the protection of its basic rights. So this contradicts everything that international law seeks to achieve. And the silence in the past of the international community has been very disturbing and confirms for Israel the fact that it can get away with defying international law. And it shouldn't be separated from two present realities. The first is this unprovoked attack on Gaza, which killed civilians and Palestinian children and didn't result in any kind of pushback from the international community. And secondly, the upcoming Israeli internal elections, in which Lapid, the current prime minister, wants to show, as former supposedly centrist political figures in Israel have done in the past, like Shimon Peres, prior to elections, they have engaged in unprovoked violence against Palestinians in order to convey a message to Israeli voters that they will be unconditionally harsh and tough in their treatment of the Palestinians. and that despite the supposed image of moderation, they're really no different than the Netanyahu Likud kind of leadership that is overtly repressive and violent in its attitude toward the protection of Palestinian basic rights.
Legally, Richard, what can the 6 Palestinian NGOs do now, whether locally or in any other arenas like The Hague or the European Union? What can they do legally? Their offices are now literally shut.
Well, this is, of course, a flagrant violation of the legal rights of the Palestinian people living under occupation. But how that kind of law is implemented is primarily a question of politics. There are many platforms that have the potentiality of acting in a manner that would indicate objection to what Israel has done and imposing some kind of cost on Israel for doing that. The UN has that potential, but it's confronted by the prospect of US vetoes in the Security Council and of a sense that what the General Assembly can do has no legal force, that it's no political pretension of being something that is obligatory. From a longer term perspective, any country can, or political organ of the UN could request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, or the Palestinian Authority could submit a complaint of grievances to the International Criminal Court at The Hague. These processes take a long time, and they nevertheless probably are of value because the very fact of taking this kind of action brings greater visibility to the wrongdoing that Israel has done. And the fact that Israel has been getting away with severe violations of international law for years and years, and it's unduly punished the Palestinian people as a whole. And the international community, such as it is, has a solemn obligation to defend the rights of the people that are as vulnerable as the occupied Palestinian people have been shown to be. And this is one more demonstration of that vulnerability, that Israel can do whatever it pleases, and so far nothing adverse happens, and that sends a terrible signal that the only way of resisting is through some form of armed struggle. And of course, the Palestinians have a right of resistance, which has itself been defamed by being characterized always as terrorism, whereas the state violence, the excessive violence of the Israeli occupiers is treated as Israel's right to defend itself, or under the broad rubric of security, and is in that sense given a pass from the perspective of international law and the international society.
So in a sense, when it comes to legal actions, who is entitled to take any legal step? Is it the Palestinian Authority, or can these NGOs approach the UN directly via the Human Rights Council? How does it work in terms of procedures?
Well, certainly the PA has the legal authority to initiate some kind of investigation in the International Criminal Court or in the General Assembly of the UN. It has that authority, and in my view, should act on that basis with seeking a very strong resolution of condemnation for this flagrant behavior on Israel's part. Whether the NGOs have an independent right they have no right in the International Court of Justice, which is only open to states and to organs of the UN system. They might have a right in some national courts, especially that have funding relations with these organizations, and exercise international criminal extraterritorial jurisdiction. And that would be a very important venue. They'd have to get some kind of jurisdiction over the defendants or whoever was responsible for issuing this order. So it's a rather technical question about how much access is there in domestic courts for violations of human rights in a foreign context.
Say, for example, Richard, if we talk about the European Union, which has got full-scale relations with Israel, and it's got as well maybe full relations with the Palestinian Authority, and many of these countries financially support these NGOs. Can the PLO or these NGOs approach the European Commission? Or the European Court?
I'm not sure what the jurisdictional rules are for the European Court. I think they do. Certainly, if Israel is a member, but I doubt that they are a member of the European Court of Human Rights. And I don't know under what conditions access to such a tribunal is available. There have been cases against Turkey in the European Court of Human Rights, and Turkey is not a member of the court. And I'm not sure how that authority would be exercised, but it's an important issue to find out more about than I'm presently aware of.
Richard, what does it mean really, this action, which was practically executed this morning, this dawn, the act of the raid? What does it say, or what legal implications does it have on the so-called Oslo Agreement? because the two parties, at least until now, despite the fact that we may find some interpretations indicating that the Oslo Agreement has been nullified some time ago, but what does it say about the relations between Israel as an occupying power and the PA as an authority which actually has got hardly 4% control, and even this 4% can be invaded and violated anytime the occupying power sees fit?
Well, I think it's one more indication of the failure of the Oslo framework, and it suggests that Israel acts as it wishes, despite supposedly granting administrative authority to the Palestinian Authority in Area A. In point of fact, whenever it claims security or terrorism, it acknowledges no legal constraints. And it so irresponsibly uses these words of inflammatory effect and is not held accountable. It's really a question of a failure of accountability in relation to the Oslo framework, in relation to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. It's a total collapse of the efforts of international law to provide some kind of reliable means of holding those who violate fundamental rights accountable. And until there's a politics of implementing the potential for accountability, these geopolitically empowered actors will do what they want to do, and do it for a variety of reasons. As I suggested, that here they're motivated by domestic politics, maybe by a longer range plan to convince Israelis themselves that the time is now right, that they can effectively annex the West Bank or exercise almost total de facto control over the West Bank, even if they don't formally annex it. So it's in a context that is
14 hours.
disturbing.
If we adopt a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach and talk about international law, international human rights law, psychology, international relations, and political science, one may get, based on longitudinal observation, that if the Palestinians use violence, they are described as terrorists, and if they use their peaceful, legal, NGO human rights approach, they are being raided, invaded, executed, and shot, or possibly imprisoned. And if they talk in the media or publicly, they are branded anti-Semites. I mean, there is this deadlock or lock or power structure which Palestinians find themselves really in a frustrated situation. Have you got any explanation to this correlation, please?
Well, I think Israel learned from the South African experience that the a greater enemy of the kind of imposed discriminatory structures that they've relied upon to create and maintain a Jewish state is under moral and legal and political threat. And the most effective way of making that threat really a danger to Israel is not through weaponry or armed struggle, but it's through the politics of delegitimation. And they view and have viewed for the past decade criticism as sufficiently dangerous to their way of maintaining a Jewish state in a post-colonial world that they are prepared to use these dirty tactics of labeling any kind of oppositional behavior as terrorism, whether it's violent or nonviolent, and of treating criticism, whether responsible or irresponsible, as expressions of anti-Semitism. So it's a refusal to deal with opposition and criticism, and an inability to be able to respond in some way that is itself within the bounds of civilized discourse. So that, as I've tried to say in other settings, in one fundamental respect, it's encouraging to the underlying Palestinian struggle because it reveals an Israeli awareness of their own vulnerability. And they wouldn't engage in this kind of behavior if they hadn't seen what happened to South Africa, and they hadn't felt the fragility of their claims to Jewish dominance or supremacy and apartheid structures in a post-colonial world where the peoples around them, unlike the sort of opportunistic governments, the peoples surrounding them are all in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. So I think it reveals something quite deep and opportunistic in the current frame of thinking that prevails in Israel.
Right. One final question, please, Richard, if I may. On a few occasions and in numerous of your publications, you talked and tackled and discussed the issue of how long the occupation can go on. Is there a way at the moment that you could think of on any possibly avenues to operate or to work towards ending the occupation from now onwards?
Well, I think that the special rapporteurs of recent years in the UN have begun to be very explicit about this occupation becoming unlawful by the degree to which it has relied on behavior that violates the fundamental obligations of the occupying power. And it was only intended as a temporary transitional framework to allow the occupier a time to withdraw from holding this kind of administrative authority. And the UN way back in '67 unanimously passed this resolution 242 calling upon Israel to withdraw and for both sides to find a just solution for the refugee problem. And Israel has made it clear that it's not interested in implementing that resolution and has no intention of withdrawing and allowing a Palestinian sovereign coexisting state to emerge. So that I think there could be a call by the Security Council, theoretically, or General Assembly more likely, for an advisory opinion on these fundamental questions from the International Court of Justice. Again, there's no expectation that Israel would obey, but the very fact of calling Israel to account in this way is part of the process of delegitimating the present set of arrangements. And it can work to isolate Israel internationally, which was part of what finally led the white supremacist leadership in South Africa to decide they'd be better off with a constitutional democracy than trying to maintain a criminal form of control over the Black majority population in their country.
Richard Falk, a world-leading authority in international law and a former UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. It's been a great pleasure having you as usual, and many thanks from Palestine 100 Initiative, Palestine House here in the UK. Many thanks and goodbye.
Goodbye. Good to be with you as always, Makram.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.